This is the IBJ podcast for the week of Monday, June the 10th, 2024, brought to you by Taft. I'm your host, Mason King. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Our subject today is a little touchy, but it requires some discussion due to the effect it can have on your financial future and the quality of your relationships with family members. This episode is all about inheritance, including the best and worst ways you can deal with a life-altering influx of money and/or property. The bottom line is that the inheritance recipient benefits from someone's death, and that seems distasteful. Nobody wants to look greedy at the expense of a family member's life. But because it seems distasteful, we don't talk about inheritance very much. And because we don't talk about it, some folks don't handle it very well. Maybe it helps to start with a little context. According to the Federal Reserve, the average inheritance today is about $46,000. Although the vast majority goes to wealthy families and more than 2/3 of households receive nothing. It's also smart to keep in mind that your perception of a potential benefactor's wealth is probably wildly off. So making assumptions about future inheritances is a big mistake when doing your financial planning. IBJ personal finance columnist Pete Dunn, aka Pete the Planner, has seen many recipients mishandle and waste inheritances, especially when they view them apart from their long-term financial strategies. Pete also has thoughts about how much you would need to inherit in order to immediately retire, why putting a big down payment on a lake house might not be advisable, and why preventing family squabbles should be a key goal in planning to divide your assets. Here's our conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome back to the IBJ podcast, Peter Dunn, aka Pete the Planner. Pete, how is your summer so far?
Good. I go to bed early, so now the blackout shades in my room are getting put to use. Long Indiana nights. I think people sing songs about long summer nights. I have nightmares about long summer nights, but I'm fine. Thanks for asking.
Oh, yeah, sure. That doesn't sound like a terrible problem, so I'm not going to...
No. Blackout shades. I'm glad I went to college for that. It's great.
Right. So my suggestion for a topic today was inheritance, speaking of tricky problems. I know that in your life as a financial planner and as someone who provides financial planning advice, this comes up frequently. It is tricky, however, because the bottom line is that you are benefiting from someone's death. And that seems distasteful. And because it seems distasteful, we don't like to talk about it. And because we don't like to talk about it, people often make bad decisions when they come into this money, or they are affected by emotions that they perhaps didn't expect. Is that consistent with your experience?
Pretty fair assessment. I'd say for this conversation today, what I'd love to do is I'd love to keep it in the perspective of the receiver as opposed to a person planning their estate. So because I think that's your point of, yeah, we talk about estate planning as someone who's going to provide for others, but it is inherently uncomfortable to say, Uncle Harold's going to die. I'm going to get a new Pontiac. That's uncomfortable.
Maybe the first we need to talk about is what we mean by, for us, what a sizable inheritance would be, just to dial up the uncomfortableness. I mean, some people would think $10,000 is a big deal. Some might draw the line at 50. Others might come from such wealth that $100,000 basically is the beginning of game-changing windfall. I will say, according to the Federal Reserve, according to my research, the average inheritance today is about $46,000. But there's a big caveat in that less than a third of all households in America receive any money. And then, as you might expect, the size of the inheritance for that remaining 1/3 kind of tracks with the wealth of the family. So that top 10% of households might inherit an average of $175,000. But then there's a pretty steep drop off.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about this, I don't think the size of the inheritance impacts my advice here, because it's all based on this idea of, do you as the receiver already have a complete financial plan? And what I mean by complete is your wishes are met if you live, die, or disabled. I view a complete financial plan as if your wishes are achieved if you die, live, or disabled. And so If that is the case and you get $10,000 or you get $10 million, you could argue it actually shouldn't impact your behavior whatsoever. So I think this conversation should be limited to, what if you don't have a complete financial plan? Or what if the amount is so much that you're almost forced to do something different because it feels more like a foundation or a legacy or true generational wealth?
Was I right saying, though, that you can end up in a situation where you have heightened emotions, where either you are, you got this mixed blessing where a loved one has died, but suddenly, bam, you got $50,000. Do you have any moral obligations with inheritance? I think some people would think, the acid test is, well, Uncle Mason would have wanted us to do this.
Yeah, interesting. So just for clarity, I have never personally received an inheritance, been written out of several wills. No, I've never received an inheritance, but I've witnessed a lot. And what you just said is always the phrase I hear. Oh, they would have wanted us to go to Maui. Like they always, that is, to me, I don't want to judge someone if you look through the lens of, well, they would have wanted this. But I've always felt it's a little too convenient. I mean, really, well, they would have wanted to be alive, right? Like they don't want you out there buying a timeshare. They want to have another Thanksgiving. So I don't love that justification, although there's something pure about it. There's something altruistic about saying, I do feel a pressure to do the right thing with this. So that part of it is reasonable.
Let me back up a little bit. How long does it take to settle an estate? So Uncle Mason, who's the heir to the Campbell soup fortune, dies tomorrow. Do I get a check in the mail next week?
In some instances, actually, yeah. If you're a life insurance beneficiary, if you truly are a beneficiary on a life insurance, which you don't always have to be the survivor, the most immediate survivor. So that can actually happen pretty fast. Otherwise, it can be as little as a month, right? It can be more commonly a few months. And as you and I both know, because we read the stories in the media, it can take years too. But for most people, a couple, 3, 4, 5, 6 months.
And what about the process takes time? What is happening behind the scenes?
Well, first of all, I am not an attorney nor a tax expert, but what takes so much time behind the scenes, the legal work. There's a lot of attorneys involved, and there can also be court filings involved, and processes like that simply take time. I would also note, as the executor of a will, that person has only so much time, and it's a pretty big responsibility to get all through it. They have to coordinate with the other people and the other interested parties. So just time passes. There's no like hard and fast waiting periods throughout the process. It is simply a byproduct of a lot of work to do.
All right, so let's say that Uncle Mason's estate has settled. I get my check for $50,000. Should I spend the money right away?
Yeah, of course not. First, I will note, and if I can back up for a second, I think one of the biggest challenges in all of this is when someone knows of a family member or interested party's wealth, and they make the presumption that they will eventually benefit from an inheritance. I think that's where most of the mistakes occur. And occasionally they occur after the fact. But I would say, Mason, the first thing you want to do is you want to figure out any sort of tax liabilities you might have, especially if it's a pretty giant estate and you might or might not be financially sophisticated. So I would check on that. There is a federal estate tax. Now there is a carve out, but there's a federal estate tax. We live in Indiana, so there's no state estate tax and there's no state inheritance tax. But you are going to have to understand your tax burden depending on what state you live in and if you are subject to federal estate taxes.
How do I figure that out? Is it a professional that I can contact?
You should go to your tax professional would be answer 1A. Answer 1B is Google it, right? Like at least have an understanding of knowing how these funds came in. Taxes were likely not withheld. And so you're going to owe some tax on that. And so that's important. Anytime someone takes in a gross amount of money and taxes aren't withheld, it creates a lot of issues. And that's very frankly where people can find themselves with IRS liens and things like that because they spent through the entire inheritance. They paid off their mortgage, or they bought a new home, or they bought a boat. And then there's no money left over to take care of Uncle Sam's requests, which aren't requests, they're sort of requirements.
The carve out for the federal taxes is fairly high, as I recall. I mean, it's in excess of like $10 million.
Yeah, it is, as of 2024, $12.92 million, I believe, is the threshold. If the state is higher than that, then there can be taxes. Below that, not necessarily taxes.
Okay.
That's a lot of money. I mean, quite clearly. To inherit more than $12.92 million would be to inherit quite a bit.
Let's say I get $500,000. And so my assets are now nicely over $1 million, my total assets. Should I just quit my job tomorrow?
No, it is weird. And this is always an unfunny statement to say. It's amazing how little $500,000 can do. I mean, it is truly remarkable how little $500,000 can do. It would, in perpetuity, provide about $15,000 to $18,000 a year of income, which is neat, kind of an annuity that way. But if you start chipping away at the principal more than 3 or 4% a year, it is going to exhaust itself. I think a person has to ask themselves when they receive an inheritance, should this impact my life by shortening my retirement savings requirements? Should it allow me to enjoy my life more now? Do I need to rectify my past by paying off my debts? I think where people can get in trouble is that it is the impetus to grow a lifestyle, right? It is to say, oh, we're going to buy that lake house we always wanted. Not an uncommon move, by the way. And if that's the case, then you've actually just created a tremendous number of expenses you didn't have, even if you paid entirely for the purchase of the home. You got property taxes, you've got all the maintenance and upkeep and utilities. And so it's not unusual for people to actually make their financial life worse after receiving an inheritance.
I saw something that I think that you had written for us a while back. If in order to instantly retire, to be able to flip that switch, you need to have at least 25 times your current income. So if I make $100,000 a year, I really would need to have 2.5 million in investable assets.
Yeah, and that is true. It is meant to be a benchmark, right? It's not a hard and fast rule, but to be honest, I like it somewhere between 25 to 33 times your income. So really, based on interest rates, where they're at, I kind of like 33. So that'd be 3.3 million as opposed to 2.5 million. So yeah, let's say you're making 100 grand a year and you inherit $3.3 million. You could retire. I mean, you could. I can't say I've seen anyone do something like that. It also depends on your age and your aspirations and the age of your children and those sorts of things. But if it is 33 or 25 times your annual income, you could actually turn it into full income replacement.
Okay. So I can invest that money. I now can bring in basically what I was earning as a working man just via those assets.
Yeah. Here's what's unusual though. And this is where a person has to be really honest with themselves. Let's say someone has a moderate level of financial stability, right? They've got a savings account, maybe they've got a 401k, but they don't have a lot of investing sophistication. And then all of a sudden put upon them, it's not a burden, but it's put upon them as a large chunk of investable assets. That same person that knew how to manage a moderate amount of stability in a 401k and a savings account doesn't actually have the sophistication to handle that much more money. So that is where getting a really good advice starts to matter. I've always believed, money simply magnifies who you are. If you got a moderate amount of money and you've got a certain level of character and behavior and discipline and those sorts of things, then you get a lot more money. It is going to be supercharged. So if you have an impulsivity issue, right? Even if you're a hoarder and you've got a moderate amount of income and moderate amount of financial stability, if you inherit millions of dollars, you will become a hoarder of nicer things. And that's it. And that doesn't give you more stability.
Where is it a good place to park that money while I'm figuring out what I need to do?
So the technical answer here is an FDIC insured bank account, right? I mean, that's the technical answer, but it's not actually a practical answer. Can I just say what I would do? Because I would if the assets came over what's called in kind, meaning if they came in over as individual securities or investments, I would just leave them as they are until I figured out what I wanted to do. If it came over in cash, I would just put it in a high yield money market account I mean, there's accounts easily getting 4 or 5% right now. Park $1 million for a year until you figure it out, and you've just gotten paid 50 grand for your trouble. So yeah, I would just park it either as is or in a high yield money market account.
So we know that one thing we don't want to do, unless it is just painfully obvious that it's possible, we don't want to retire immediately. We don't want to immediately take on assets that are going to end up costing more than they're worth. What are some of the other bad decisions you've seen people do when they inherit like a sizable chunk of money?
It's not what they do, but it's what they don't do. They don't go get estate planning done. Like if you inherit a bunch of money, which functionally changes the makeup of your estate, and you don't change the estate plan, it's the most on the nose self-own of all time. Like it is I'm the benefactor of all this money, and then what am I going to do? Right. So that would be a challenge. I would say there's nothing wrong with letting off a little steam, a little relief valve of, hey, we're going to go on a vacation. Maybe don't go on your dream vacation, but I'll be honest, there's nothing wrong with purposefully spending a little bit of money so you don't have the impulses to spend a lot of money. I've always felt that to be true, whether you receive a year-end bonus from your employer or an inheritance from a loved one that you've lost.
Smartest things you can do then. If I have any high interest debt, should I take care of that immediately?
Potentially, right? The smartest thing you can do is to maintain a reasonable relationship with a qualified financial professional. Like once you have investable assets, if you get the call that you got an inheritance, you should just be calling so-and-so on speed dial and telling her that you got an inheritance and it just fits into your financial plan. Like, I don't know, like what I don't love to do, and you started the segment this way, is like, it's uncomfortable to think about putting yourself in this situation, because in order to do it, you really do have to think about the very specific people in your life that would have to die in order for you to be put in that position. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about this. I would like to think, I don't know, I think there's a pressure to pay it forward too, to keep paying it forward. The idea of exhausting the previous generation's sacrifice and having it have a finite end is kind of weird. Well, no, it's not weird. That sounds so judgmental. For me, I would have a hard time just being like, thank you. Wow, we're better. Like that would be hard for me.
It's interesting you bring that up. In the reading that I was doing for this podcast, I kept seeing a statistic about how much of inherited wealth survives to the next generation.
Let me guess. Can I guess?
Go ahead.
30%.
That's exactly it. Right.
Look at that.
So I burned through 70% of it as the average inheritor. And what was interesting to me about that was it's always brought up in these conversations that I've seen online. And it's kind of a shamey statistic. It's like, boo, your ancestors, built up all this wealth, and you're going to have this proclivity or this desire to burn through it.
Can I give you a theory about that?
Yeah.
I think it's a bit of a chicken or egg situation. I think when someone knows they're going to get a sizable inheritance, they figure out how to spend it before they get it. And so then within that too, they don't put as much pressure on themselves to push themselves towards their financial goals, because they know that money is eventually going to bail them out. And so theoretically, when the money arrives, even though you may not spend it immediately, it is consumed for years because it's taking care of business that wasn't completed. And I think that's probably a lot of the story. If I may, I would love to give you an example. So back when I was a financial planner, I am no longer a financial planner. Back when I remember speaking to a specific client that said something to the effect of, we have very young kids and very elderly parents. My parents they didn't say loaded, but they insinuated they were loaded. On top of that, again, they're elderly and we're the lone heirs. So we're actively not saving for our kids' college education. In lieu of that, the money we would save there, we're having better family vacations because we know that inheritance will someday come in and super fund and supercharge the college education. That is an example of sort of premeditated inheritance spending. And look, the weird things happen. I don't know the conclusion of that story. I really don't. But stranger things have happened that it didn't work the way they thought.
Okay, let's take a quick break so we can hear from our sponsor. This is the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
All right, we're back with this week's edition of the IBJ Podcast and my interview with Pete the Planner about the best and worst ways to handle a sizable inheritance.
There was a great piece that I saw, and I think it might have been a survey conducted by the Federal Reserve of what people thought their inheritance would be and what they ended up getting. And it is always significantly less.
Absolutely. This is my observation. So I don't want to say this clinically. This is just an observation. When another person appears to be more financially stable or well off than you, then you just assume they're a lot more well off than you, right? Like you don't go, oh, they're marginally better than us financially. They're my parents. You think, man, they are 30 years older than me. They've had a lot longer to do this. I had a comfortable childhood. They want for nothing. They're going to leave me a ton. And unless you've dug through their finances because you've helped them make decisions as they age, I buy that. It's typically a lot less than you think. And then, depending on how their estate planning cracks out, who knows? Maybe they left a bunch to the church, which is not uncommon either.
I haven't had to deal with this yet, thank God. But I mean, there are all kinds of late in life expenses, depending on how late in life you get, that can deplete, your nest egg.
Yeah, let's go back to that example, the real life example where I don't know the ending, right? Elderly parents. What if those elderly parents didn't have long-term care insurance? What if they both went into a long-term care facility? What if they survived for 3 or 4 years and these low millions or high hundreds thousands of dollars worth of assets get dwindled down and now it results in a very small inheritance? That is not out of the question by any means. It's funny. We always think that a person has their biggest spending years early in retirement while they're still active and on the go. But what you often see, it's the tail end, the more sedentary years of retirement when a person is forced to spend more money for their care. So this idea of, oh, they're modest. They live a modest lifestyle. They're going to have a ton. They live modest now by choice, but later they may not live modest by choice. They may be forced to spend money.
I want to go back to the idyllic scenario where you already have a relationship with a financial planner. You already have a plan. And so whatever you inherit just gets fed into the plan. That's the best scenario. I'm assuming that doesn't happen a whole lot.
I honestly don't know. I would assume it's common, right? Like here's how that would go down. I find out I get a $300,000 inheritance. I would call my financial advisor and I would say, hey, out of a bit of a windfall, so-and-so, whatever. Can you plug $300,000 into our plan and let me know how that changes things? The person will go to work. We would meet 2 weeks later, and they would say something to the effect of, well, you can retire 2 years earlier, or this means that your estate will be worth $900,000 more at your mortality age, or we can accelerate that giving plan that you wanted to do, right? So that's what optionality should look like. It's no different than when a business has a capital raise, and what is said to happen is you say, okay, we're going to inject capital into our business. Which when people hear that, they think, well, they raised money. But when you literally go into a spreadsheet, you go into a cash position, you inject that cash in, and then based how financial modeling works, everything in the model changes based on that capital. The same thing should happen with a financial plan. With a good financial planner, it is plug and play. Put a number in and then watch the output and the downstream effect.
We established, I think, a few episodes back, the way that our financial plan works, my wife's financial plan works is I'm expected to die at 90. And when I die at 90, I will have no estate. It'll all be gone. So the difference, the big windfall for me would be, well, do you want to have an estate?
I think that's part of it. It's funny. On my radio show, we talked about that this week of the Die with Zero book. There's a book called The Die with Zero. And it's the whole concept is don't leave anything for anyone. I just find that impractical because you don't know when you expire, right?
Yeah.
I don't even think it's like a moral or ethical thing. I think it's math. I just think it's hard to figure that out. I would say, Mason, another way to think about this is I think most people should be able to answer the following 3 questions with certainty at any given time. So we'll go with you. You can answer your real answer or at least think about it. Okay. I will ask the question. Mason, if I gave you $1,000 right now, do you know what you would do with it?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So file it away or whatever. Mason, if I gave you $10,000 right now, do you know what you would do with it?
Yes, I do.
If I gave you $100,000 right now, would you know what to do with it?
No.
Okay. So this is where this gets really weird. Let me guess that the $1,000 thing would not be satisfied if I gave you $10,000.
Actually, it would.
Really? That's
Yeah.
unusual. Most people have a different idea for 1 and 10. So that is to say, what would happen is they would go do something bigger or different. And what is arguably the most tangible thing, which is just $1,000 away, doesn't even get accomplished.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just reveal what it is because maybe it's a bad example. We need a new roof, and that's going to cost probably $13,000 to $15,000. Right now, we're all about saving for the roof.
Oh, great. That's great financial planning. The fact that if you had an extra 1,000, it goes towards the roof fund is phenomenal. But you know what? I've known you long enough to know that you haven't always thought that way. And that wasn't always an answer for you. You would say, oh, we'd go on do a little something like that, or we get this. And then the 10,000, something completely different.
Yeah. So the 1,000 to 10,000, easy. That all goes. 15,000, easy. More than that. We're like, that opens up a whole bag of cats, if that's a term.
Here's what it should do. It should accomplish the $1,000 thing and the $10,000 thing and another thing. But when you have 3 different answers, it's indicative that you're a little more fickle than you should be. And you don't actually have what we like to call a next dollar strategy, which is I live on a certain amount of money. And if I get more than that, I'm going to accomplish this. That is healthy. That is an aspirational idea.
Now, I had this idea that, I mean, the things that we always talk about as financial necessities or pseudo necessities, could all be satisfied with a big windfall, like making sure you have an adequate emergency fund.
Right. And here's another way to think about this. Recently, I've written about this, is this idea of, as a working person, Mason, your emergency fund should be 3 to 6 months expenses, somewhere in there, in a perfect world. As a retired person, it has to be a lot more than that because it is the only emergency fund you'll ever have without liquidating investable assets to refill the emergency fund you depleted when an emergency happens. So in some instances, if you inherit money in your late 50s and early 60s, the right move, depending on your cash emergency fund position, might just to take the inheritance and have it become your emergency fund.
Okay. Well, great. Well, that's a good example.
I like that I could provide one good example today. That's why I'm here. That's what I'm here. One every 25 minutes.
Or otherwise, I mean, it goes into the investable asset fund. And then potentially what can happen is that all it does is boost my lifestyle.
Yeah, that's why I love, again, just the outline of the idea of what would you do with 1, 10, or 100,000, and then just do that with different amounts of money. And it's a kind of a fun exercise, but it's a practical exercise that it just keeps you focused. You can't have wildly different answers. I think about what I would do if $100,000 just came to me right now. What would I actually do? I would just top off the college funds and then probably sit on some cash. I mean, and that is just the truth, especially with what I would view to be a slightly volatile market and the ability to get 5% for my money at the bank. That's probably what I would do.
What if you inherit real estate? What are your options?
Boy, you have the wrong guest. No.
Great.
Aside from the tax aspects of that, which I'm not the person for that, there's a couple ways to think about it. One, without doubt, it's kind of a pain in the neck. I mean, it just is. Whether you have to fix it to sell it and you have to do all of these sorts of things, that's a pain. You could theoretically rent it out and turn it to an income producing asset, right? You could become an instant landlord. Just add Hawaiian shirt and you're Mr. Roper, just like that. Or was it Mr. Furley?
Both.
Yeah.
It was Roper, then it was Furley.
Great. Or you could sell it. And of course, you got the tax ramifications there as well. And I think it just really depends on where the house is and what condition it's in to be able to answer that. But I don't know. I've witnessed that a lot, and almost always is just such a pain in the neck.
I have an example of a pain in the neck situation.
Let's hear it.
So a friend of mine, her mother died and she inherited the house. So she's thinking, well, do I want to sell it or do I want to fix it up a little bit and rent it? I mean, they all have their potential good sides. The immediate problem, however, is that there is another family member living in the house. And that family member, even though the family member has other options, if that person had to leave, they wouldn't be living on the street. Family member doesn't want to leave. And I mean, it's a mess. It's a mess.
If I may, and this is an observation, that's terrible estate planning. It's the definition of terrible estate planning. Your estate planning is not just who gets what, your wishes and facilitating that can be sensitive to so many parties. I think if you've got a complicated family situation like that and you're printing your will off online, some online form, then you really shouldn't be doing that. I mean, you should spend the $1,500 to $3,000 it takes to get a quality estate plan. And by the way, I think I'm being conservative with those numbers.
Yeah, I know you didn't want to get too much into, well, what is the bequeather before he or she dies? I mean, what are the best ways to keep this from becoming a big mess for the next in line? But yeah, I mean, that seemed to be potentially an avoidable problem. And I've got an even better one.
Okay.
Unless you have one more point you want to make about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I can think of an example where a central Indiana real estate developer passed away, left a multi-million-dollar estate to his 5 children, and each received an equal share. And this is a complicated estate. Its value is tied to multiple asset classes. It was real estate, household goods, stock holdings, bank accounts, and interest in 5 different companies. And it was a mess.
I think about people looking at that from the outside, reading the initial article about that, because those things get published, and thinking, nice problem to have. I don't know. That's a nightmare. That's an absolute nightmare. And yes, some estate planning could account for that, but that's the nature of a complicated financial life. It doesn't all of a sudden become simple when you die. That's a nightmare. That really is a terrible situation. And I'm guessing incredibly stressful. And I'm guessing it led to quite a bit of conflict.
There was some litigation.
There you go.
One of the reasons why this is always on my mind is because I love to read financial advice columns. And one of the 2 main themes for financial advice columns, and I'm not yours necessarily.
Oh, no. I'm wondering if you've cracked the code of Pete the Planner. Let's hear it. Tell me what I write, Mason. You tell me.
This is not about you.
No, everything's about me. Go ahead.
Okay, fine.
2 things. What do you got?
2 things. Biggest one, family squabbles with inheritances. 2, division of assets and divorce. Yeah. Those are the 2 biggest ones that I've encountered. I think you have a broader palette than that.
Yeah, you're right, though, because as my dad always used to say, you can pick your friends, you can pick your nose, but you can't pick your family. Family's top. Family and money do not go well together. Every time I see it go well, it's shocking because it's so unusual. And I think as generations persist and they evolve and change and the sensibility of financial America changes, it only gets harder. Oh, the sensibility of those who lived through the Great Depression is not the same sensibility of those who survived COVID, right? It's a very, very different mentality. And so that problem will only get worse.
And then we covered something that I'd say towards the end, which is a situation where you think you know how much your folks have, but you really don't. We discussed this a couple of years ago, but I want to revisit the suggestion that you and your relatives discuss inheritances while everybody is still alive.
Yeah, I'm trying to think practically here and realistically. I don't think the takeaway here should be discuss inheritances if you're the receiver. I think it would be, hey, what do I need to know about your estate plan? So not from a greed standpoint, but just from a execution standpoint. Like, what do I do? I think that's fair. I think the amounts don't particularly matter. I really don't. And I think that's where you get into the premeditated spending the inheritance before you get it.
Gotcha.
I think it's like, do you have an estate plan? Yes. Who's the executor? So-and-so. Great. Do you have any particular wishes that are in that? Yes, we do. Put them in that. Beyond that, I don't know how much it matters unless you're helping your elderly parents manage their personal finances. I don't think the amount should matter.
Okay, well, good. That answers my question. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we sign off?
Just reinforce that simply going to magnify who you are. And if that scares you, pause and ask yourself why. If you're enthused by that, not out of some sociopathic mindset, but out of sort of like, all right, I'm comfortable. I'm confident. In fact, it actually won't change my life whatsoever because I'm just going to keep on keeping on. Then you're fine. I personally want to create a financial life, and I have, that I would be appreciative of an inheritance, but it just wouldn't impact me because I don't want it to impact me. I don't know. That might be, I'll be honest, that might be from a place of privilege, but I just don't want to have to depend on someone to die for me to win. I hate that dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we should acknowledge, this is inherently privilege. This is a great example of privilege. I was smiling though for a second though, because I thought about, because we're obviously trying to, teach our 8-year-old about money management at the beginning of the life now where he is earning money for doing manual labor for us. And I was thinking, he simultaneously has an understanding of investing money now and to reinvest, and that the stock market is a good place to do that. But if you gave him $100 and said, go buy something, he would buy $100 of cherry spray.
Bold choice.
So, that is the person who he is right now.
Yeah. Well, I think, but given his age, I think you and I can give him a pass.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny that he's both people. And I don't know, maybe to an extent, we're all kind of both people. The stuff that we know that's right.
Well, maybe the answer should be he should buy $100,000 and the maker of cherry Sprite stock.
He was not interested in, I also suggested McDonald's, and he was a flat no.
Wow. These kids today, am I right?
He's like, oh, what about Apple? Like, no.
I told you kids are different.
We don't have that kind of money. All right. Well, I will let you get on with the rest of your summer, but that's a big help. Thanks for wandering into this marsh of uncomfortableness.
Hey, that's where I succeed the most.
We always need people to guide us through the mark.
My thanks again to Pete Dunn. And folks, before you get on with the rest of your week, there are several news and feature stories in the latest issue of IBJ that I want to bring to your attention. And first up, 100 years after the U.S. Olympic swimming trials were held in Broad Ripple, Indianapolis again will have a major role in assembling America's team. The 9-day trials start on June 15th at Lucas Oil Stadium, and IBJ has a 32-page guide to the event, including the Hoosiers competing for spots on the team and the support from Indy's corporate community. Also in this week's paper, Daniel Bradley unpacks Westfield's 8-year, $186 million infrastructure plan. And Dave Lindquist introduces us to 2 former chefs from famed brunch spot Milktooth, who are striking out on their own with a combined restaurant, bakery, and market in Speedway. Again, you can find these stories in the latest print edition of IBJ or online at ibj.com. And thanks again for making time this week for the IBJ podcast. I'm Mason King. Hang in there, everybody. We'll be back again next week.